Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me. Well, I can begin. My dad was a mechanical engineer. My mother was an artist, later became a nurse, and I've always been interested in engineering and artistic kinds of things. And I ended up going to the University of Michigan to study naval architecture, which I thought was a nice combination of engineering and architecture. I did that for a year and decided, well, it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And I dropped out. I went into mathematics and got an undergraduate degree in math. And at some point along the way, I don't remember when, I got interested in, I think I read or heard about McCulloch and Pitt's idea of artificial neurons being related to logic circuits in computers. And so for graduate school, I applied to the University of Michigan again, where I lived, in computer science. And so I entered the graduate program and wound up studying, well, lots of things. It was a very interesting period. It was a kind of unique graduate program there. And I ended up in a lab called the Logic of Computers Group, which was directed by three professors, one of whom was John Holland, the originator of genetic algorithms, and another was Arthur Burks, who is an electrical engineer and a philosopher, very distinguished professor who actually completed von Neumann's book on self-reproducing automata. And Bernie Ziegler was studying modeling and simulation. And so the three of them had this NSF-funded group. I became a research assistant in it. And so the whole atmosphere was really focused on genetic algorithms on the one hand, and cellular automata, which is what von Neumann's self-reproducing system was formulated as a cellular automata, and then modeling and simulation. And I wound up doing my thesis. We were really working with Bernie Ziegler. We were modeling the modeling process in terms of systems theory. And so my thesis was playing out some of these ideas in the realm of cellular automata. So I was sort of in that mix of things. I wasn't a typical computer science student. I've only taken 2 courses in programming in my entire life. And although I taught Fortran for many years as a graduate student, I've never been a hacker. So I skipped that stage for some reason and was really interested in these biological connections, and the idea of cellular automata was very appealing because with very little specification, you can generate enormously complex behavior, and that kind of that sense of the discrepancy between what needs to be specified and what the consequences are was something that appealed to me. I was heavily influenced by John Holland and genetic algorithms, but I never really bought the algorithm in the sense of I felt that there were a lot of other stochastic algorithms, optimization algorithms that could compete with genetic algorithms. But I was influenced by the idea. And so combining that with an interest in neural networks led to some of our earliest reinforcement learning systems. Mm-hmm. Well, let me back up a little bit, because then I got my PhD and I went to I took an assistant professorship at the State University of New York in Binghamton, which is now called Binghamton University. And it was a very interesting program focused on general systems theory. And I was there for just 2 years. I didn't really buy the general systems theory perspective that was prominent there. And I heard of a postdoc at the University of Massachusetts on a project studying adaptive neural networks. And this was 1976 or 1977. And so no one was really studying neural networks, but I was interested in that. And I drove up and talked to Bill Kilmer, I was hired as a postdoc. I took a leave from my assistant professorship and went to Amherst and worked on this interesting project. I eventually resigned my assistant professorship to continue the postdoc, which is something I don't recommend students doing these days. But it turned out to be a good move. I eventually became a faculty member at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst and stayed there until I retired just a few years ago. But reinforcement learning, I guess, when I went to Amherst, the project that I was a postdoc on was funded by the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. And it was a project that was instigated by Harry Clough, who was a physiologist who worked for the Air Force and had the idea that neurons worked to increase something and to decrease something else. He called it the theory of the hedonistic neuron. And the project, whose principal investigators were Bill Kilmer, Michael Arbib, and Nico Spinelli. They were professors at UMass and had gotten this Air Force contract to see if Clough's ideas made any sense, see if they were worth studying and pursuing. And I became a postdoc on that project. And not long after that, Rich Sutton, who was who had recently graduated from Stanford, joined the project as a research assistant. Mm-hmm. And so Rich and I really began working together. I guess 1977 is basically when this began, and our project was to see if Harry Clough's idea of the hedonistic neuron was something interesting and whether it was worth studying. So that's what we began doing. And the surprising thing to us was that the idea of learning by trial and error, which is what Clough said neurons might be doing, was not really well studied. It's not supervised learning. In fact, to this day, I think many people don't really understand the distinction between reinforcement learning and supervised learning. And most of the work that was being done, not everything, but most of the work was supervised. And reinforcement learning uses a less informative teaching signal, a reward or punishment signal, rather than a specification of a desired response, which is what supervised learning systems do. So we were surprised, and we had the leisure at that time. It was a 3-year grant or contract, and we were able to pursue a lot of ideas and to really study the history to see if these ideas had been worked out and were they worth anything, had they been shown to be useless, and so on. And so it was a very, it was a very interesting period. And we found that, some work had been done, but we felt it hadn't really been appreciated. It was really became what is now reinforcement learning. We were not the first. It goes way back to many earlier people, specifically in psychology. The idea of Thorndike's
the puzzle box, right? Thorndike's puzzle box.
The puzzle box, and the cat in the puzzle box is trying out things, and eventually stumbling on something that lets it escape from the box, and he put it back in the box, and it would get out in less time, and eventually it would immediately let itself out of the box, and he did this with fish, not the same box, of course, but he did it with other animals, and this became called trial and error learning, and it's different than supervised learning because no outside agency was telling the cat or the other animals what they should do. They had to discover it for themselves. And so this is what Clough postulated that neurons do as they're as they're operating in a nervous system. So we concluded that it was an interesting idea, hadn't really been exploited. In fact, it had been rejected by AI researchers as being too weak. And in psychology, it was associated with behaviorism, which had been rejected to a large extent in favor of cognitive psychology. And we felt that there were many valid criticisms of behaviorism, but in some sense it was like throwing out a simple principle without really sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so this very simple principle, very, very well supported empirically, but had been relatively neglected certainly in AI. Although some early AI, particularly Marvin Minsky, worked with his thesis was a reinforcement learning thesis, or at least part of it. So those were exciting times, and I became a faculty member. Rich was my first student, and I have to say that the whole development of this owes a tremendous amount to students that I've had. I've had fantastic students. Rich was the first, but followed by many others who, just wonderful, creative people who've gone on, in most cases, to really do some great things. So, I really owe so much to my wonderful students. And one of the first things we did in this project was build what we call an associative search network, which was really combining an associative memory idea, which was prominent in the literature at that time, correlation matrix memories and so on, but they were supervised. And we created one really by combining sort of Holland's ideas of search with the associative memory, and we came up with the associative search network, which stored memories, but no system told it what memories it should store. It had to discover them to see what produced the most reward. And so that was sort of an early few papers that we wrote, and then continued from there. But so that's probably well enough of my early. I sometimes think I should have been an architect rather than a computer scientist. I'm an atypical computer scientist because I'm really not interested in computers. I use them and have always relied on tech support. People ask me questions about computers, and I say, "Ask my son. I have no idea." I'm an atypical computer scientist.